members voted. Does any member wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 212, the nays are 190.
Ms. Chu votes no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert votes aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 213 and the nays are 200. The previous question is ordered. Go on. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
I ask for a recorded vote, please.
For what purposes? A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote. members voted? Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? On this vote, the yeas are 213 and the nays are 203. The yeas have it. The resolution is adopted. Without objection to the motion, it to reconsider is laid on the table. The House will be in order.
You might need to gavel a couple more times.
The House will be in order. For what purpose? For what purpose does the gentleman from Idaho seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 4821, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection, the House will be in order. Pursuant to House Resolution 838 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 4821. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 4821, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Department of the Interior, Environment, and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2024, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations of their respective designees. The gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Simpson, and the gentlewoman from Maine, Ms. Pingree, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I'm pleased to begin consideration of H.R. 4821, the fiscal year 2024 Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriation Bill. Before I get into the bill, I want to commend Chairwoman Granger for her steadfast leadership of the Appropriations Committee and her ongoing support. I'd also like to thank the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. DeLauro, for her work on this important legislation and other things. And I'd also like to thank Ranking Member Pingree for her partnership and the subcommittee members for their work on this bill, although Ms. Pingree and I might have some differences of opinion on this bill. H.R. 4821 provides $25.4 billion in new non-defense discretionary spending, which is $13.4 billion or 35% below the fiscal year 2023 level. The bill also rescinds $9.4 billion in unnecessary funding provided to the EPA, the Presidio Trust, the Council on Environmental Quality through the Inflation Reduction Act. Cutting funding is never easy or pretty. But with the national debt in excess of $33 trillion and inflation at an unacceptable level, we had to make tough choices to rein in federal spending. Last Congress alone, $3 trillion was spent outside of the normal appropriations process. That's $3 trillion that went on to the national debt. Simply holding funding flat is not enough. We must work to curb our out-of-control spending and get our budget back on track. This bill does that. This legislation prioritizes critical needs within our reduced allocation and addresses specific interests and concerns brought to our attention through more than 8,000 member requests. H.R. 4821 fully funds the Payment in Lieu of Taxes program for fiscal year 2024, which is estimated to be $515 million. It also makes critical investments in Indian country by providing funding for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Bureau of Indian Education, and Indian Health Services at fiscal year 2023 levels or above. To combat catastrophic wildfires and protect communities across the country, the bill includes $1.6 billion in discretionary increase includes a $1.6 billion discretionary increase to fund wildfire activities without budget gimmicks. It also provides a $2.65 billion cap adjustment for wildfire suppression activities as authorized. To address these priorities, while right-sizing the agencies under our jurisdiction, the bill reduces funding for nearly every other appropriation in the bill, and many agencies receive double-digit percentage reductions. The EPA is reduced by $4 billion or 39% below the fiscal year 2023 level. In terms of policy, the bill makes important steps to reduce regulatory burdens imposed by the EPA, expand across to critical minerals and natural resources, and promote domestic energy production. Such efforts include, as soon as I can get these pages separated, halting the EPA's job-killing regulations, such as repealing the recent Waters of the United States regulations and rules that target reliable energy sources and domestic manufacturing. Limiting abuse of the Endangered Species Act regarding species such as the sage grouse, the gray wolf, bison, and the lesser prairie chicken. Expanding access to critical minerals and promoting proper management of our nation's forests, and requiring oil and gas lease sales. These policies will help boost our national security, reduce energy costs, and create American jobs. Mr. Chairman, this bill will help manage our public lands wisely, meet our commitment to our brothers and sisters in Indian country, and restore the fiscal responsibility necessary to get our economy back on track. I urge its adoption, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume. And I ask for unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
As ranking member of the Interior and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee, I'm deeply concerned about the majority's lack of urgency to fund the government. The continuing resolution expires in less than 3 weeks. But instead of getting to work negotiating with the Senate on a full-year bill, we are wasting time on bills that violate the terms of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. I strongly oppose the fiscal year 2024 Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill. This harmful bill debilitates America's ability to address the climate crisis and hobbles the agencies within its jurisdiction. It slashes funding for the Environmental Protection Agency by nearly 40%. That's nearly $4 billion less than we appropriated in FY23. It also rescinds more than $7 billion of vital investments provided by the Inflation Reduction Act for the United States to take immediate, economy-wide climate action. Climate change has reached a crisis point, and experts agree that we must take bold action to avoid a major irreversible catastrophe. In addition to the cut proposed by the State and Foreign Ops Bill, Republicans' Interior bill virtually eliminates the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, established by the Inflation Reduction Act to mitigate the costs of climate pollution through investment in low and zero-emission technologies. But the damage inflicted by this bill extends far beyond climate change. The bill wipes out environmental justice program and cuts $1.4 billion from the environmental and climate justice grants made possible through the Inflation Reduction Act. It curtails the progress that has been made to ensure that all people are equally protected from our environmental and health hazards. This bill abandons our most vulnerable groups that currently bear a disproportionate share of negative environmental impacts, which includes large swath of rural communities that I and many of my colleagues across the aisle represent. The bill also slashes funding for enforcement of the Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, which will enable polluters. The cuts in this bill are so severe that even agencies that usually garner bipartisan support are targeted for damaging reductions. Funding for the National Park Service, for example, will be cut by 13%. This bill also significantly reduces funding for the arts and humanities agencies. The cuts to the Smithsonian Institution and the National Gallery of Art are so deep that they will be forced to reduce the number of hours or days each week that the museums are open to the public. When our constituents bring their families to see our nation's capital, I think all members in this room expect they should have access to these museums, but this bill takes that away. The bill also fails our nation's wildland firefighters. It does not provide any of the funding requested by the administration to support wildland firefighters and their families through better compensation, safe housing, and health and well-being assistance. Without this funding, firefighters will lose the compensation increases first provided in the bipartisan infrastructure law. And sadly, this bill also contains numerous discriminatory riders, as well as an exhaustive list of anti-environment riders that seek to derail any effort to combat climate change and undermine clean water and clean air protections. They give an open invitation to exploitive oil, gas, and mineral leasing by blocking environmental regulations and even overriding judicial review. At the same time, the bill suppresses clean energy production. Clean, renewable energy is critical if we are going to save our planet for future generations. The majority of Americans support becoming carbon neutral by 2050, and they support prioritizing the development of renewable energy sources and preserving biodiversity for the benefit of future generations. The austere and irresponsible cuts in this bill do not align with their values. I want to thank the Chair and Ranking Member DeLauro for their tireless efforts on this committee. I want to thank the Chair, Mr. Simpson, who, as he mentioned, we don't always agree on everything, but we have a chance to work well together, and the staff on both sides of the aisle who work tirelessly. I oppose this bill. I urge my colleagues to protect the world you are leaving to your children and grandchildren and oppose the bill. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Idaho
Mr. Chairman,
is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Stubner.
The gentleman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 4821, the Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2024. This year's appropriations bill is a win for Minnesota's 8th Congressional District and our nation. It is abundantly clear the Biden administration has an anti-mining, anti-farmer, anti-American worker, and anti-energy independence agenda. This bill stops that agenda in its tracks. The Department of Interior's mineral withdrawal in northeast Minnesota that forces us to be dependent on Chinese-owned, child labor-using mines in the Congo. This bill stops that agenda. The Biden administration's WOTUS rule that punishes farmers for puddles in their fields. This bill repeals the WOTUS rule. The EPA's abuse of the Endangered Species Act to list the northern long-eared bat, which has stifled responsible logging and forest management. This bill stops and reverses that. Mr. Speaker, I am proud that we finally have a common sense funding bill that puts American workers and rural America workers first. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that this bill also provides funding for critical infrastructure projects in Minnesota's 8th Congressional District, including wastewater treatment projects in Bemidji, Bram, and Silver Bay, Minnesota. I want to thank Chairwoman Granger, Chairman Simpson, and my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee for all their hard work on this legislation, and I urge all my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Idaho reserves. The gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I'm very pleased to yield 6 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, the distinguished ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, and my good friend, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized.
Okay, it won't move. Thank you so much. I've thanked the gentlelady, but I want to say a thank you to Chairman Simpson, also to Ranking Member Pingree for your work on this legislation. And I'd also like to say a thank you to the majority and the minority staff, particularly Rita Culp, Jocelyn Hunn, and Farouk Ofaso. When it comes to caring for the environment, ensuring our air is safe to breathe, our water is safe to drink, and we are resilient in a changing climate, this bill takes the side of the most egregious polluters and climate deniers. This legislation stakes an aggressive anti-environment stance with a crippling 39% cut to the Environmental Protection Agency. The ensuing collapse of our means of protecting the environment and public health would mean more asthma cases, more cancer diagnoses, and more unmitigated natural disasters afflicting American families. I would like to share a portion of a letter sent to members of this body from the League of Conservation Voters and co-signed by 61 environmental organizations, including the Trust for Public Land and the National Parks Conservation Association. And they said of this bill, and I quote, "Following a summer of record heat waves, horrific flooding, and wildfire smoke blanketing much of the nation, this bill would gut the agencies charged with protecting our environment and our health and would massively undermine last year's historic climate legislation. The Inflation Reduction Act, it would also introduce an onslaught of extreme anti-environmental policy mandates that have no place in the appropriations process. This attack on our health, lands, wildlife, biodiversity, air, water, oceans, and communities is unacceptable and must be rejected," end quote. The bill cuts the EPA's Clean Air Program by at least $200 million, eliminates funds for environmental justice. It cuts the EPA's Infrastructure Grant Program by a staggering $1.8 billion. These are not numbers on a page. We are talking about the air in our skies and in our lungs. This is the water we drink, bathe in, and cook with. These are basic life necessities that we have a simple obligation to protect for the American people. In addition to endangering the global climate and public health, this bill slashes funding for the arts, including the National Endowment for the Arts flagship grants for the Arts Projects Program, which benefits individual and community and the well-being, and it supports our economy in all of our 435 congressional districts. This bill will prohibit the Smithsonian from highlighting the contributions of Latinos in U.S. history and culture by not making it possible to move forward with the National Museum of the American Latino, making Hispanics invisible. It's shameful, and it does not represent America's values. The ramification of cuts in this bill would reach every corner of the Interior Department. It damages our public lands, it promotes dirty energy, jeopardizes biodiversity, and disarms America in the face of a climate crisis. Sharp cuts to the National Park Service mean fewer seasonal employees and furloughing existing permanent park employees. The funding loss translates to dozens of employees who are trying to do their job every single day. They will be furloughed. Those at Yellowstone, Glacier, Sequoia, Zion, and many more of our nation's prized national parks. These are beloved public lands, and the cuts mean longer wait times, fewer services available when our constituents and visitors from around the globe travel to experience these jewels of our nation's geographic diversity. The majority is also opening our public lands, the property of the American people, for oil, gas, and mineral leasing, in some cases going as far as blocking judicial review of these transactions. The majority is hindering clean energy projects while promoting fossil fuels lease sales. And the majority is accelerating ecosystem decline by abandoning protections for our most vulnerable apex predators like the gray wolf and the grizzly bear. I have proudly worked across the aisle to protect our environment for Americans past, present, and future, and I am immensely disappointed to see the majority abandon their commitment to conserving America's fragile lands and natural resources. I would not think Republicans need reminding of their own party's history, but this bill is a notable reversal from the proud and bold conservation efforts of the Republicans I have worked with in decades past. I need not remind my colleagues which president created the EPA, Richard M. Nixon. Finally, as we continue to see in each of these partisan bills, the legislation includes riders that prohibit funding, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the accessibility in the federal workforce, none of which belong in any bill, but especially appropriations. With its dangerous and costly cuts, indefensible riders, I must vote against this bill. I urge my colleagues to do the same. It will take bipartisan support to get the 2024 Interior Bill signed into law, and this bill does not achieve that. I appeal to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. End this partisan charade and join with Democrats at the negotiating table. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentlewoman from Maine reserves. Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just note that neither the chairwoman of the ranking member of the full committee or the ranking member of the subcommittee in their comments never mentioned the $33 trillion debt. And over the last Congress, $3 trillion that was spent outside of the regular appropriation process. That's what's causing the problems that's what's causing the problems in this country. And this is what reducing spending looks like. And every time you try to reduce spending, you would think it's nothing but death and destruction. If I believed what was just said, I wouldn't vote for this bill. But I think she's wrong on so many accounts. Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Mouser.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank Chairman Simpson for his leadership and his very responsible leadership. I do rise today in strong support of H.R. 4821, the very fiscally responsible Department of Interior, Environmental, and Related Agencies Appropriations Act. I represent the 9th District of Pennsylvania, where part of that district includes the Marcellus Shale natural gas, one of the largest reserves of clean natural gas in the world. Not only does natural gas industry support over 250,000 jobs in Pennsylvania, but it also contributes $24 billion to the Commonwealth's GDP. Meaning Biden's continued assault on American energy, including the natural gas industry, is truly an assault on Pennsylvania's workforce and economy. Since taking office, the Biden administration has taken so many actions to weaken the natural gas industry, blocking pipeline construction, implementing burdensome regulations, and issuing costly new rules and taxes. This makes foreign producers with less pollutant controls far more competitive within the energy industry. Many of these nations where these producers exist use these funds to fund terrorist activities and fight and fund Vladimir Putin's war. We should take these things into consideration, Mr. Speaker. While this administration seeks to limit American natural gas, despite it that it is 50% cleaner than other fossil fuels, this appropriations bill supports domestic energy production because Republicans recognize we must embrace all of the above, but also all of the below solution to achieve energy independence and dominance. This legislation requires resumption of gas lease sales on previously restricted federal lands. It also prohibits a number of onerous regulations, such as the EPA's Clean Power Rule, that would be detrimental to American energy production. Among other provisions in this legislation will, Mr. Speaker, benefit the American consumer, farmers, manufacturers, small businesses, the U.S. economy as a whole. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Idaho reserves. Gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, the distinguished ranking member of the Defense Subcommittee, the former chair of this subcommittee, and my good friend, Ms. McCollum.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Ranking Member. And I rise, Mr. Speaker, in opposition to this legislation. The bill that the majority put before us today grossly underfunds the Department of Interior, and I'm just going to mention 2 areas, the Environmental Protection Agency and the Arts and Humanities. The ranking member listed the others. Once again, the cuts that the Republicans made to the appropriation bill do not honor the funding levels that were negotiated by the White House and the Republican leadership in the Fiscal Responsibility Act. A promise was broken. Over 35% of the reduction to the top line of this bill is simply irresponsible. The bill claws back billions of dollars from the historic Inflation Reduction Act, trying to plug up the holes created by the massive top line cut. This will damage the ability of the United States to respond to climate change and help communities who are currently affected by it. And we are affected by climate change in all of our districts. As ranking member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, I'm very aware that the DoD considers climate change to be a top national security issue. Harming our country's ability to respond to this threat will put us at a severe global disadvantage. This bill's drastic cuts to the EPA and the Interior Department also affect the life, health, and safety of all Americans. It will increase risk to all people who rely on the EPA to safeguard their air and water, to clean up harmful pollution, test for chemicals in their products, and respond to emergencies. There is one small bright note in this bill, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for continuing their work together to honor our trust and treaty obligations to our Native American brothers and sisters. But on a whole, the bill before us does not, in my opinion, reflect a serious commitment to meet the needs of our constituents. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. Mr. Chair, I could come up with some tax cuts to repeal to pay for the things that I'm asking for. With that, I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields. Gentlewoman from Maine reserves. Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Carl, for the purposes of colloquy.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I like your choice of ties, by the way. We match. Mr. Stimson, thank you for your remarkable work on this bill, particularly under these trying circumstances. $33 trillion in debt. Folks, we cannot spend our way, we cannot regulate our way out of that debt without having some sacrifices that are in this bill, quite frankly. You've done an outstanding job identifying the key priorities despite a challenging allocation. One area of concern I'd like to address is related to the Biden administration's handling of royalties of federal land. I'd like to emphasize the impact on Warrior Met Coal, which produces metallurgical coal crucial for steel production and happens to be the largest exporter from the Port of Mobile, Alabama, which I'm honored to represent. Regrettably, Warrior Met Coal's federal lease application with the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management has been marred by delays. The Interior Department shifts requirements, including the recent demand for an environmentally impact study on top of a comprehensive environmental assessment completely over a year ago, have been the latest obstacles in a nearly decade-long effort to secure this lease. As you're aware, the Mineral Lease Act, which requires the maximum economic recovery of coal within the proposed lease area. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing permit delays, federal coal is not currently being efficiently mined, causing further setbacks in federal coal mining. Every day that passes without progression results in the loss of critical revenues for coal royalties for the affected communities. The state of Alabama and the federal government, these are the fees that will help pay some of this debt down.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This situation is unacceptable, and I'm eager to, with my colleagues and your staff, to identify a way to move forwards, ensuring that the Department of Interior and Bureau of Land Management upholds their responsibilities, that under the Mineral Lease Act, that impacts communities receiving essential funding and requirements. Now, regarding the specific language included in this bill, it's highlighted the importance of the Bureau of Land Management production of domestic coal on federal lands, with participation emphasizes on the distinction between the metallurgical coal and the thermal coal. Big difference. Additionally, the bill is focused on combating wasteful spending, reducing bureaucratic, maintaining responsible funding levels to serve the best interests of our constituents in this nation. To address the needs of priority, emphasize programs protecting crucial minerals and promoting oil and gas lease sales. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my time, I thank the gentleman for drawing the House's attention to the Department of Interior and Bureau of Land Management's responsibilities under the Mineral Leasing Act. I would be pleased to continue to work with him on how the agencies in this bill handle royalties on federal lands as we move through the FY 2024 spending process. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Idaho reserves. The gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, the distinguished ranking member of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, my good friend, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I rise in opposition to this bill. We've felt the effects of climate change for years in South Florida, draining millions from state and local government coffers to respond to the cycle of natural disasters. So what is the majority's response in this bill? A crippling 39% cut to the EPA and policy provisions that will severely undercut efforts to curb CO2 emissions. We haven't seen EPA funding levels dip this low since 1991, which ironically is when experts told us that we needed to start tackling climate change. So what does that mean for people watching us at home? More asthma, higher rates of cancer, and more frequent natural disasters upending Americans' families' lives. We need to invest in clean energy not just right now, but yesterday. Besides underfunding clean energy efforts, this bill also neglects the cherished Smithsonian Institute. I was extremely disappointed that this bill bars funding for the new National Museum of the American Latino and the operation of the existing Molina Family Latino Gallery. The legislation that created this museum enjoyed strong bipartisan support just 3 years ago. The Latino community is so integral to America's heritage. It baffles me why the majority would block the Smithsonian from highlighting their historic and cultural contributions, especially since Congress established this museum. We must embrace the beautiful mosaic that makes our nation so incredible, and it includes investing in public museums to provide a cultural and educational platform. This bill also, by the way, underfunds the Holocaust Memorial Museum. I respectfully requested the majority to include an additional $2 million over fiscal year 2023 for the museum's education program. The intentional genocidal violence inflicted on Israeli civilians and the unconscionable apathy of many nations, and far too many in our own nation, is a sobering reminder that Israel is surrounded by hostility and danger. Anti-Semitic threats and attacks in the U.S. were already skyrocketing, up 37% in 2022. Only by fully funding education programs can we truly combat this rise in hate. Let's take some pride in America. Let's not cloak bigotry and ensure that we can educate people and promote understanding and unity. Build up our public spaces, not starve and neglect them. I urge members to vote no, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentlewoman from Maine reserves. Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Simpson, for yielding me time. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of the ongoing work within the Interior Bill. As the representative for the 5th District of Colorado and Vice Chair for the Natural Resources Committee, I have long supported our critical mineral independence, striving to roll back regulations and burdens on this industry. However, my background on the House Armed Services Committee and my longstanding support of our national security causes me to caution support of Section 466. Railroad Valley in Nevada has been used and cared for by NASA since 1996 as the world's premier optical sensing calibration site. The Railroad Valley site is used daily to calibrate cameras on board of satellites that photograph the world daily. Commercial companies have used this playa to provide critical support to satellites that monitor the ongoing war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East and many other critical needs. It is for that reason that I am here advocating for the Railroad Valley playa as a national security asset. According to a study done by NASA of the capability this playa provides can only be found in 4 sites around the world. Current and future needs of our commercial space industry and intelligence community are strongly reliant on the benefits this site provides here in the continental U.S. This is not something we can turn to in other places because the other 3 sites lie in China, North Africa, and Israel. Additionally, NASA's study concluded that the Railroad Valley site would be the best option in any case to provide the optimal sensing calibration. It's important to protect the critical mineral rights, but it must not come at the expense of our national security. We must do both. I thank Mr. Amadei and Chairman Simpson for their tireless work on this issue and their commitment to our future work on compromised language and protection of our national security assets. I look forward to supporting the language that comes out of conference for the Interior Appropriations, and I urge adoption of the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Idaho reserves. Gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes for the gentleman from Arizona, the distinguished ranking member of the Natural Resources Committee, and my good friend, Mr. Grijalva.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, and thank the ranking member for the time. This Interior and Environment Appropriations Bill, much like the House Republican appropriations bills that have come before it, is an extreme magna manifesto. It's not at all representative of the values of the American people. This bill is full of reckless policy riders that undermine the most basic environmental protections, take us backwards in the climate fight, and introduces climate change denial as part of a policy for the Republican majority. It pads big oil's profits by selling out our nation's public lands, their waters, their wildlife, and their endangered species. It rips away the historic and hard-won climate wins in the Inflation Reduction Act that are not only for protecting our future, but growing the middle class with hundreds and thousands of good-paying jobs. It bullies American communities that have already been overburdened by pollution and guts environmental justice efforts. We've seen many of these riders in the Natural Resources Committee this year, and they don't have a future as standalone bills. So instead of putting in the work to govern and finding meaningful solutions, seeking compromise that the American people actually want, House Republicans are shamelessly burying these provisions in the most extreme interior appropriations bill we've ever seen. House Republicans are following the marching orders of their monarch, former President Trump. It doesn't matter how many times he's indicted for fraud, for stealing classified documents, or for orchestrating an insurrection, or a coordinated attempt to overthrow a democracy. They're here doing his bidding to prop up big oil and its favorite oligarchs, no matter who gets hurt. To protect the American people, I and 33 of my colleagues submitted an amendment to strip from this bill the dangerous policy riders, but the Rules Committee, controlled by the most extreme members of the Republican caucus, wouldn't allow a vote on the floor. My Republican colleagues are always quick to protest about process.
Gentleman's time has expired.
1 minute.
But it seems that
The
their
gentleman
action... Thank you.
Recognized for an additional minute.
My Republican colleagues are always quick to protest about process, but it seems that their actions speak louder than their crocodile tears. The rejection of this amendment demonstrates yet again that this appropriations process is a sham, and this particular bill that ignores climate and the effects of climate change that are ongoing worldwide and in this country It undoes any protections to vulnerable communities and communities in general by gutting essential programs and monitoring and enforcement of clean air and clean water, and it erases history. It says we're going to wash this part of history out, as, for example, the blocking of the Latino Museum, that part of American history does not exist, and we will not appropriate for that. I urge rejection of this bill and this legislation. It is not just a step backwards, it's dismantling of basic public health, environmental, and consequential issues dealing with the identity of this great nation of ours. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman from Maine reserves. Gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Yakum, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Indiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, the National Environmental and Policy Act, or NEPA, was created to balance environmental protection with our need to build infrastructure. The NEPA process was once timely and concise. But over time, NEPA has become a four-letter word associated with frivolous litigation, mountains of paperwork, project delays, and cost overruns. Congress has taken meaningful bipartisan steps towards reform, but the work is far from over. My amendment would require the Council on Environmental Quality to report on current NEPA bottlenecks. It mirrors the legislation I introduced yesterday with my friend Jimmy Panetta, the Studying NEPA's Impact on Projects Act, which would require annual reporting on NEPA litigation, average page length, and timeliness. The American people deserve a government that does not give radicals a heckler's veto over roads, bridges, and energy projects. I want to thank the Chair and Ranking Member for including the Yakum-Panetta amendment in this en bloc. I urge my colleagues to support, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Idaho reserves. The gentlewoman from Maine is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields the balance of her time. The gentleman from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we have no more further speakers. The gentlelady would like to close.
My time. I have yielded back the balance of my time. It's all
and
yours.
The gentleman from Idaho is now recognized.
Let me say, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
The challenge here, as I stated earlier, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle never saw a problem that they didn't think a government program could solve. Anybody that thought that we were not going to have to reduce spending, I think was living in a different world. When you're facing 33 and getting on $34 trillion in deficit, the reality is you're going to have to cut spending. Now, this is not a criticism of them. I think they honestly believe that all the profligate spending that went on the last couple of years was absolutely necessary. I think the American people expect us to start addressing the debt that our children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren are going to face, and this is what cutting spending looks like. It's easy to write a bill. Anybody could write a bill if you had unlimited funds. And that's pretty much what they've had last year and the year before. In spite of almost having unlimited funds to write the Interior bill, they actually took $1.6 billion in wildfire fighting costs and made it emergency spending. We had to bring it back into the bill where it should be, instead of using budget gimmicks. That put us $1.6 billion behind. And we said we're not going to hurt Indian country with this bill, even with the cuts that we had to make. We were going to fully fund PILT payments. We were going to make sure that we took care of those things that were necessary, like wildfire fighting, because those costs are going to go up. That meant the rest of the bill was going to take some cuts. And we used rescissions by pulling back some of the money that was spent over the last several years to make sure that the cuts in this bill were not as dramatic as they would otherwise been. This is still a 10% reduction in the overall bill. So I would disagree with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Death and destruction will not follow if we pass this bill. And I would encourage my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for the amendment under the 5-minute rule. This bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. No amendment to the bill shall be in order except those printed in Part A of House Report 118-261, amendments en bloc described in Section 3 of House Resolution 838, and pro forma amendments described in Section 4 of this resolution. Each amendment printed in Part A of the report shall be considered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be subject to amendment except as provided by Section 4 of House Resolution 838, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It shall be in order at any time for the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee to offer amendments en bloc consisting of amendments printed in Part A of the report not earlier disposed of. Amendments en bloc shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for 20 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member on the Committee of Appropriations or their respective designees. Shall not be subject to amendment except as provided by Section 4 of House Resolution 838, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. During consideration of the bill for amendment, the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their respective designees may offer up to 10 pro forma amendments each at any point for the purpose of debate. For what purpose does the gentleman from